Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my tight end tier list going into the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 30 plus tight ends and kind of giving you guys my thought process on where they're going to potentially land in terms of their overall value this upcoming season. I'll talk about specific stats, my analysis, and kind of give you guys my overall thought process when approaching these specific players this upcoming draft season. Again, the drafts are almost underway. Many of you have just participated in your upcoming drafts this past weekend, but for those of you who still have drafts, hopefully this list can kind of give you guys my thought process on where you should value these tight ends this upcoming season. Now, before we begin, let me thank all of you who have continued to support me just in this short time. For those of you who have been around the channel for quite some time, thank you for the continued support. I absolutely can't thank you guys enough for helping me get this far. For those of you who are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're going to be creating fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the 2020 season, so don't miss out on that. Thank you very much, everybody. This has been a pretty cool tier list series, so I'm glad that you guys enjoyed it. And without further ado, let's get into this, shall we? Okay, so now before we begin, reminder, these are not 100% rankings. They are not in specific order from 1 through 32 or however many tight ends I talk about. This is not in a specific order. Just kind of putting it out there. If you want to find my actual rankings, you can go ahead and go down to the description and find my 2020 fantasy football draft guide, which I just upgraded or updated earlier today to kind of give those of you who already have it an updated version. For those of you who bought it on the website, I went ahead and sent you an email of the updated version. For those of you on Patreon, the updated version has been posted. But for those of you who are interested, go down to the description. You can find more information regarding that. All right, here we go. Starting off with the first tight end that I'm going to talk about today, Travis Kelce. Now, it's not a surprise that Travis Kelce is the first guy that I talk about because he's been the #1 overall tight end in a half PPR scoring format for 4 consecutive seasons. Travis Kelce is the best tight end in the National Football League, and it shows in his play and his overall statistics. Last season, he had 14 tight end 1 performances, and that wasn't just enough. I mean, to be honest, the fact of the matter was that even last year, Patrick Mahomes missed a couple games, and Travis Kelce with Matt Moore was still able to produce on a weekly basis. Last year, he played 92.5% of the offensive snaps for this Kansas City Chiefs offense and was a monster. The addition to Patrick Mahomes in this offense has not only allowed Travis Kelce to become a better player, but it given him more opportunities throughout the last 2 seasons. I mean, looking back at what he was able to do with Alex Smith in 2016 and 2017, those were great numbers, and he was still the tight end #1. But in 2018 and in 2019, his total overall numbers accelerated and launched to a different level. He went up in terms of his target share, 20%. His receptions went up 19%. His receiving yards went up 18.6%. His receiving touchdowns went up 33% in just the past 2 seasons. If we went ahead and took all 29 games that Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes have played together, Travis Kelce averages 9 targets, 6.3 receptions, 82.6 receiving yards, 0.48 receiving touchdowns per game with Patrick Mahomes, which is basically, if you take that into a 16-game basis, 101 receptions, 1,300 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns, and a 14.42 fantasy point per game average. All in all, it's not a surprise that Travis Kelce is drafted in the second round because he absolutely deserves it. And when it comes to the separation of talent and productivity at the tight end position, Travis Kelce is far and away the best. Moving on, another player at the S tier, and in my opinion, a guy that almost caught Travis Kelce this past season was George Kittle. Now, George Kittle only played 14 games last season, but in those 14 games, he produced 11 tight end 1 performances, the only other tight end that had double-digit tight end 1 performances last year. He averaged 12.86 fantasy points per game, which was the identical number that Travis Kelce produced last year in his 16 games. So if, in fact, George Kittle was to have played a full season, he could have potentially been the tight end 1 and dethroned Travis Kelce last year. Looking at what Kittle did in terms of his overall stats, last season he played 87% of the offensive snaps, but he only ran 361 routes, which means, I mean, to be honest, that's a pretty ridiculous number. Playing 87% of the snaps, that means he played at least 900 total snaps, and 361 of them were only routes. I mean, in comparison to Travis Kelce ran 614 total routes last year. But George Kittle, when he runs those routes, they're designed to get him the ball. George Kittle typically is the 6th offensive lineman for this team and is a fantastic pass blocker and run blocker for the San Francisco 49ers offense. But when he goes out for routes, the ball is always going in his direction. Last season when he ran a route, he was targeted 29.64% of the time. An absolutely insane number, and he continues to get better. He had an incredible breakout season in 2018 where he set the ceiling, putting up the most receiving yards by a tight end in a single season, and then went ahead and almost had the most receiving yards in a single game. Kind of fell short of Shannon Sharp's record in 2018, but in 2019 found himself with Jimmy G, and eventually, if he had stayed healthy, could have been a monster. Of course, I know that he has these, shoulder injuries, and that's always a concern, but let's take this into account at this moment in time. The wide receiver position for the San Francisco 49ers is a mess. There's a lot of injuries taking place, and the more I see players go down, the more I think George Kittle is going to be an even bigger part of this offense. So I think George Kittle is in line for another fantastic year here in 2020. Moving on. We have ourselves our A-tier player, starting off with Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews had an incredible sophomore season this past season with the Baltimore Ravens as their number one receiving option. Nobody else had as many receiving yards and or receiving touchdowns as this guy for this team, and it wasn't a surprise because of how dominant he was down in the red zone, being able to score 10 touchdowns last season. But Mark Andrews isn't an every down kind of player. He's not going to play 85% of the offensive snaps like a Travis Kelce and or a George Kittle. In fact, last season he only played 44.2% of the offensive snaps for this team because he's not a blocking tight end. And this offseason, they even got rid of Hayden Hurst, trading him away to the Atlanta Falcons, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But the opportunity for him in this offense, in an offense that targeted the tight end position 40% of the time, their target share was incredible last season. I think Mark Andrews' opportunity is even going to be greater this upcoming season. And though he is currently in the A tier, he has a great opportunity to jump into this S tier conversation. Like I mentioned earlier, the fact that he ran or only played 44.2% of the snaps was kind of ridiculous. And he only ran half as many total routes as Travis Kelce last year. But similar to a George Kittle, when Mark Andrews runs routes, he is heavily targeted because the play is designed for him. When he ran a route last year, he was targeted 31.82% of the time, which means on one of every 3 dropbacks when he runs a route, Lamar Jackson's heaving it in his direction, and he was absolutely balling out, to say the least. Now, besides the fact that Hayden Hurst is now gone and more targets will be available potentially, and potentially we'll see him on the field more this upcoming season, last season wasn't a beautiful, unstoppable year. He was injured for majority of the season. Starting from week 2, he was dealing with injuries. For those of us who owned Mark Andrews, you'll know that he always had that questionable tag. You always got reports on him missing practice throughout the week and being questionable for Sunday's games. But regardless, even playing 15 games, he still was an incredible overall productive tight end with a breakout season last year. If we go ahead and have a healthy player, and on top of that, we get game scripts for this Baltimore Ravens offense in which they're in the favor of, okay, the Baltimore Ravens are in a close contest. We got to come back and try to throw the ball in the second half instead of just running out the clock like they did last year. I think the opportunity and the ceiling for Mark Andrews just continues to rise. I am really confident in his potential this upcoming season. Talking about our next player on our A-tier list as of this time is a player that honestly is talked about in this top 3-4 conversation all the time at the tight end position. It's Zach Ertz, and not by accident. Zach Ertz has been an incredible tight end and has honestly proven to me and to every team in the National Football League that you can run your offense through your tight end position and find success offensively. I mean, in 2018, he broke the record for the most receptions by a tight end in a single season with 116 on 156 targets, breaking Jason Witten's record. Zach Ertz then the following season, was injured for quite some time this past season, only missed 1 game, but was dealing with a lot of injuries, was called upon to do a lot for this team. And though he wasn't as productive in 2019 as he was in 2018, it had to do with the fact that he was the number 1 receiving option for this offense. And they had to, potentially respect that. And defenses heavily guarded Zach Ertz and prevented him from having success. That's why a guy like Dallas Goedert was able to have 80+ targets and so much productivity from the tight end position. You never typically see 2 tight ends on a singular team have so much success as such. But in that specific scenario, last year, Zach Ertz kind of had to forfeit a little bit of his productivity to Dallas Goedert. But regardless, Zach Ertz has been an incredible tight end and has gotten better with the implementation of Carson Wentz in this offense. With Carson Wentz in the games that they've played, Zach Ertz has averaged 9.27 targets, 6.54 receptions, 68.8 receiving yards, and 0.46 receiving touchdowns per game On a 16-game basis with Carson Wentz, that's 105 receptions, 1,100 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns, which is a 12.78 fantasy point per game production on a weekly basis. To be honest, if in fact this offense continues to lean in the direction that they did late last season, where the wide receiver position is completely bare and they do not have a reliable enough receiver out there, they're going to have Zach Ertz continue to play 85% of the snaps and be the number one receiving option, which makes him a pretty enticing pick in the 5th round if he's available there in your leagues, especially in a half full PPR format. The last tight end here on our A tier is Darren Waller. Darren Waller, in just 1 year, was able to become the starting tight end for this Las Vegas Raiders offense and take over. I mean, the productivity of Jared Cook in 2018 was even accelerated to a different level with Darren Waller in 2019. And though the writings may have been on the wall with the amount that Derek Carr targets the tight end position and all this where Jay Gruden always wants to continue to use multiple tight ends in their formations, it was kind of a surprise, to say the least, that Darren Waller was able to be as productive as he was. I mean, the fact that he had 117 targets, 91 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, those were incredible numbers. And this year, he has a potential of even improving that, because there are a lot of other receiving pieces on this offense that are going to demand respect and pull the defense. When you bring in a Henry Ruggs, when you have yourselves a Bryan Edwards on the outsides with Tyrell Williams, you have so much speed on the outside now that it's going to stretch the defense and allow Darren Waller to work the middle. And once he's able to catch the ball, his yards after the catch last season was only second to George Kittle, averaging 6.6 yards after the catch per reception. Absolutely incredible. And when we look at how much this team wants to target the tight end position, they're amongst the top 6-7 in the league in terms of tight end target share. Derek Carr wants to target Darren Waller. And when they did last year, it was an absolute success. Last year, he had 5 games of over 100 receiving yards. And though he only scored 3 receiving touchdowns, I expect that number to increase. You bring in Jason Witten through free agency to come and play that blocking tight end role. Darren Waller is always going to be a blocking tight end. But if you can go ahead and force Jason Witten to do all the blocking plays and have Darren Waller run more routes and get more opportunities that way, I can't wait to see it. It's going to be a fantastic opportunity for him this upcoming season. He is the last tight end for the A tier list. Moving on to our A tier list, we talk about tight ends that, though they can be trusted this upcoming season, a lot of people hesitate on them, starting with Evan Ingram. Now, when I look at Evan Ingram, I see a wide receiver. I mean, we just talked about Darren Waller, and to be honest, Darren Waller is a wide receiver in college. I mean, he only transferred to the tight end position in the pros, and when I look at Evan Ingram, he looks like a wide receiver in a tight end's body, playing the tight end position and taking advantage of that, because again, the coverage that is going to typically be on him isn't top, quality, especially when they put him in the slot position. He's absolutely incredible there. But running a 4.43 at the combine a couple years back, that just puts, Evan Ingram in a completely different bracket of tight ends. On top of that, even with the injuries last year, prior to his injury, with Daniel Jones at quarterback, he was a great overall player. I mean, producing 10.92 fantasy points per game at the tight end position is no joke. And if he had gone ahead and played that through an entire 16-game season last year, he would have finished as a top 5 tight end with 900 receiving yards, 88 receptions, and 6 receiving touchdowns. I mean, that in itself, a great number. The Giants always want to use the tight end position. They have in the past, and though he's been injured, even in his absence, Evan Ingram has seen players like Rhett Ellison and or Caden Smith come in and produce on a weekly basis. If we went ahead and we took all the tight ends from last year and started only one of them on the Giants for all 16 weeks, you would have found a 10.42 fantasy point per game average, which, to be honest, kind of looks like there really wasn't much drop off when Evan Ingram left, because the Giants want to target the tight end position, and Daniel Jones found comfort in doing so. When we look at a player like Evan Ingram and look at the fact that last season he played 70% of the offensive snaps when he was healthy, and on his offensive snaps ran a route 70% of the time, he's going to have so much opportunity within this offense. I think it's only a matter of time until Evan Ingram, kind of elevates himself into this next division, potentially jumps into this next tier of tight end, because his health has only been it's been his only downfall. It's been himself. Defenses can't stop him. Quarterbacks, whether it's Eli, Daniel Jones, doesn't matter. He's always been productive. And it's just only a matter of time in my eyes until he ends up having a breakout season here. Moving on. Our next tight end here on the B tier, we have Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee, prior to week 13 of last year, was a guy that caught the ball maybe 1-2 times a week. maybe 3 times a week. Otherwise, was typically a blocking tight end. And they used Gerald Everett as a receiving tight end. And outside of that, Tyler Higbee didn't get much usage considering Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, and Todd Gurley. He was pretty much an afterthought in terms of the overall productivity and approach of this Rams offense. But as soon as week 13 hit, everything changed. I mean, from weeks 13 through 17 of last year, that 5-week stretch, Tyler Higbee had 4 games of 100 receiving yards, had every single game with 7+ receptions, and had 2 receiving touchdowns. He was averaging 17.14 fantasy points per game in that 5-week stretch and was playing 93.7% of the offensive snaps. Last season, he was tied with red zone targets with Travis Kelce of all tight ends. And to be honest, with the way that this offense is kind of looking, them I think leaning towards the tight end position and wanting to run as much 11 personnel as possible and feeding Tyler Higbee the ball as much as they possibly can. I mean, it looked like Tyler Higbee was more of a safety blanket for Jared Goff than Cooper Kupp at the back end of last season. And to be honest, if that can continue and we see Tyler Higbee getting himself 6, 7, 8 targets a game and the ample amount of receptions along with that because of how good tight ends are in typically catching the ball. I mean, the catch rate at the tight end position in comparison to the wide receiver position, wide receiver catch rates, if you're at a 68, that's pretty good. At the tight end position, we typically expect 78, 80%. But regardless, if Tyler Higbee can go ahead and put together a season in which he's consistently being used in this offense and utilized as a threat offensively down the field in the red zone as a bigger target, I think the sky's the limit for a guy like Tyler Higbee, who this offseason has been focused on heavily in terms of this offense. And even Jared Goff has said, we can have 3 1,000-yard receivers, and Tyler Higbee's one of them. So I'm excited to see what their potential is this upcoming season. Moving on. Our next tier of players, starting with Jared Cook. We talked about Jared Cook a little bit earlier with Darren Waller. And though Jared Cook had a great year in 2018 with the Oakland Raiders at the time, he went ahead and he moved to New Orleans and joined the Saints. And in this little combination they had, we all anticipated last offseason that he was going to be a great tight end. But out the gate, Jared Cook was nothing. From weeks 1 through 4 of last season, he only produced 3.25 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. But after his little injury stint that he missed 2 games. The back end of the season, Jared Cook was a completely different animal. He scored 9 touchdowns in the back end of the season and was producing 13.3 fantasy points per game from weeks 5 through 17, whether it was with Drew Brees or with Teddy Bridgewater. Jared Cook couldn't be stopped. Last season, he had a 16.4 yard per reception average and only had 4 red zone touchdowns last year. That means 5 of those touchdowns came from outside the red zone. Big playmaker and a guy that if he catches the ball in stride, is such a big target. You cannot bring him down by yourself as a defender, especially in the secondary. And he was extremely successful at that. With Drew Brees this upcoming season and the offense looking as healthy and as productive as possible, I mean, with the amount of talent they have now with Emmanuel Sanders also on the outside, you have yourself Jared Cook down the middle against safeties and linebackers in which he's going to be towering over them with his 6'8" height and just mossing people as he did last year. I think Jared Cook, though he only had 43 receptions last year and 9 touchdowns, is going to be one of these guys that, yes, is a little bit touchdown dependent, but hopefully this year he gets a little bit more usage with playing a full 16-game season and being healthy. I think he has the capability of being a great tight end. Moving on, we have ourselves Rob Gronkowski. Gronkowski comes off of his little short retirement to now join the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And to be honest, at this moment in time, I was a little hesitant in having him in this tier because I don't know what we're going to see out of Gronk. I mean, the last time we saw Gronk, in 2018, he was the number 11 overall tight end in half PPR. And in 2017, he was the number 2 overall tight end. He's had pretty productive years recently, but in 2019, he took the year off, he got his body right, and he's come back. And just a couple of days ago, I watched an interview in which Bruce Arians said that Gronk looks like, the tight end he was 5 years ago. He looks healthy, he's running great, he's productive, and honestly, he's been healthy even with, all the precautions they've taken. He's been able to stay, relatively healthy even through full contact practices. All in all, I even went and looked at their practices. I watched a couple, if you went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers YouTube channel, you can go find a quick 5-minute clip there of just Gronk running routes all day long, making contact, trying to kind of be the tight end that they expect him to be, potentially be this Hall of Fame guy that is kind of going to resurrect his potential career per se. But either way, Gronk is a Hall of Famer. And the way that they're going to use him in this offense is a safety blanket for Tom Brady. Tom Brady brought him in because he needed somebody to be comfortable with. And now that they already have that meshed chemistry, I think down the stretch, whether it's down in the red zone or in important games, Rob Gronkowski is going to be a main target in this offense. As much as they want to say that there's going to be a lot of O.J. Howard or Cameron Brate, Rob Gronkowski is going to be the starter, and he's going to be able to produce. And I think he's going to have a great season here in Tampa Bay. Moving on. Hayden Hurst, the last tight end of this C tier. Hayden Hurst is pretty much filling in for Austin Hooper. Again, they traded him away. The Baltimore Ravens kind of had to let him go because, again, they were getting a pretty good offer overall. Second-round pick for him. He was formerly a first-round pick out of, South Carolina. I mean, when we look at what Austin Hooper was able to produce last year in only 13 games, Austin Hooper had 97 targets, 75 receptions for 787 yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, and was averaging 11.86 fantasy points per game, and was the number 1 tight end at the time prior to his injury. But then after he got his injury, he still ended up finishing as the number 6 overall tight end, and in fact, his finish as the number 6 overall tight end in back-to-back seasons with the Atlanta Falcons. But now that you have a tight end switch, and you bring in Hayden Hurst, who has a great potential, again, a former first-round pick, and you bring him into an offense that wants to utilize and take advantage of the tight end position. When we look at the offensive coordinator of the Atlanta Falcons, I'll always say it, Dirk Cutter is a guy that always wants to use the tight ends, use 11 personnel in his respective schemes. Because if you go back to 2012 through 2014, when he was formerly the Atlanta Falcons offensive coordinator and they had Tony Gonzalez, they were feeding Tony Gonzalez the ball 125 times a year. Then he went ahead after that job and went and became the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. At the time that he was there from 2016 to 2018, he went ahead and he targeted the tight end position 120 plus times in the 2 years that he was there, whether it was with O.J. Howard or Cameron Brate. And to be honest, it's not a surprise that he's been heavily targeting Austin Hooper since he's been in Atlanta. And I think Hayden Hurst has a really good opportunity to go ahead and take that next jump. Though he only had, 30-some-odd receptions on 30-some-odd targets last year, I do think he's going to be able to, now with the opportunity, take advantage of it and be a player that could stay on the field for potentially 80% of the offensive snaps, considering how good he is as an overall blocking tight end as well. But either way, moving on. We have ourselves Noah. Ooh, no, that's not it. I misclicked. We have ourselves Mike Gesicki. Okay, here we go. So Mike Gesicki, to be honest, a very interesting prospect because in his rookie year with Adam Gase, he was nothing. 22 receptions, 202 receiving yards, 0 receiving touchdowns. Out of Penn State, I mean, this was a guy that caught 9 touchdowns in his last year at Penn State. It was a athletic beast in the red zone, and nobody was able to really stop him in his final year there. But his rookie year in the NFL, nothing much. And to be honest, for majority of last season, he was nothing much until they finally realized, wait, why haven't we been using Mike Gesicki? Because last year from weeks 1 through 11, he was averaging 4.14 fantasy points per game, only playing 59% of the offensive snaps. Then from weeks 12 through 17, that 6-week stretch, he went ahead and turned on the afterburners and produced 11.52 fantasy points per game while playing 75% of the offensive snaps. On top of that, he played 72% of his total snap count from the slot position and had 15 targets of over 20 plus yards. This is a player that, in my opinion, can take the next step this year. Sure, even with Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback, that's what we want to see. We want to see a gunslinger at quarterback that's not afraid, that's going to feed the ball in his direction. And even when Tua ends up becoming the starting quarterback of this team, I expect Mike Gesicki to be a great, contributor for this offense. Because outside of, Devontae Parker, Preston Williams, Mike Gesicki is the next best receiving option for this team, and I think he can continue to have another great season. He was a top 12 tight end last year, should be once again this year. Speaking of another tight end that was a top 12 guy last year, Dallas Goedert. I think Dallas Goedert, because of all that has gone on with the receiving core of the Philadelphia Eagles as of this past week, with the injuries that have taken place, I really do think that we're going to get back to seeing the Philadelphia Eagles using a lot of 2 tight end sets. I mean, in the back end of that season, especially the last 5 weeks of the season, we were seeing Dallas Goedert play upwards of 85% of the offensive snaps while Zach Ertz was healthy and playing himself. I mean, in the backstretch of the season, in the last 10 games of the season, Dallas Goedert averaged 9.56 fantasy points per game, playing 78% of the snap share in those 10 weeks. And to be honest, I think with everything kind of leaning in that direction, I would want to have Dallas Goedert potentially as a late draft pick. And I think if, in fact, it ends up looking in that direction, he could be a very valuable asset. I know many of us picked him up in the waiver wire last offseason. or last regular season, and we're able to take advantage of him being a weekly start. So maybe this year he can once again, kind of reclaim his top 12 tight end ranking. Moving on. We have ourselves Noah Fant going into his second year. Noah Fant has Pat Shurmur as his new offensive coordinator. Pat Shurmur was the former offensive coordinator of the New York Giants. And know the New York Giants are going to get Jason Garrett, who loves to, target the tight end position, so we don't have to worry about Evan Ingram. I think Pat Shurmur kind of made it a point that they were going to use the tight end regardless of whether or not, Evan Ingram was healthy last year. Whether, again, it was Evan Ingram, Brad Ellison, or Caden Smith, they went ahead and they targeted the tight end position, and they had their tight end always averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game. And now that we see Noah Fant going into his second year with a little bit more experience, the fact that he is a big target, a fast target, 4.5 speed, you go ahead, put him in the slot position similar to how they used Evan Ingram last year, yards after the catch with an improved Drew Lock. I think this offense can run through the tight end position. We know that Drew Lock always liked to, focus and target his tight end in college. They went ahead and drafted him, but I think Noah Fant is going to be the starter and a guy that could really make a difference and be one of these second-year sleeper tight ends that comes out of nowhere, similar to a Mark Andrews of last season. But either way, Noah Fant, that's him. Moving on. We have ourselves Hunter Henry. All right, now Hunter Henry, without Phillip Rivers, could be a tricky prospect. Last season, he averaged 10.22 fantasy points per game, only missed 4 weeks in the beginning of the season, and once he came back, he was a different animal. A lot of us were able to pick him up off the waivers and really find a lot of success with him. But the question is, with the current quarterbacks in the Los Angeles Chargers organization, are we going to potentially find success? With Justin Herbert, I think Justin Herbert, if he takes the job or is eventually given the starting position, he's going to look to Hunter Henry and or Austin Eckler as his safety blankets. But what about Tyrod Taylor? Can we potentially see him focus on targeting Hunter Henry? When I went and looked at Tyrod Taylor's career, I went back to his days in Buffalo when he was a starting quarterback for an entire 16-game season. And then I wanted to see how much they were targeting and or how much he used Charles Clay back then. In those seasons in which he was a starting quarterback and Charles Clay was healthy and playing the full year, Charles Clay was targeted about 93 times per season, had 61 receptions per season, about 640 receiving yards, and 3.5 touchdowns per season, which in my opinion could end up being a top 12 tight end this upcoming season in the current landscape. And to be honest, with that kind of opportunity, if Tyrod Taylor is once again going to feed a tight end like that, like he did with Charles Clay in the past, I think we have ourselves a pretty good opportunity for Hayden Hurst to have himself another top 12 tight end season. I mean, last year, amongst all tight ends at the position, when targeted, he had the highest passer rating when targeted last season amongst all tight ends in the National Football League. Pretty interesting stat. Moving on. We have our next tier of tight ends, starting off with Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith, man, I'm a little iffy on Jonnu Smith because sure, as soon as Ryan Tannehill took the starting job, Jonnu Smith was more utilized in this offense. But to be honest, in an offense that already doesn't have too many passes to go around, and they're not going to give him 10 targets a game, he's not going to get the opportunity as some of these other targets that we've talked about already. I think Jonnu Smith is very dependent on touchdowns, and he might be an afterthought, and he might be a red zone only kind of guy because outside of A.J. Brown getting his targets and the other receivers, getting a couple here and there, a couple deep passes from Tannehill, I think Jonnu Smith could be a decent tight end, but we have to be very careful because if in fact he doesn't, score or the game script doesn't require him to be involved, there were games last year down the stretch where he was scoring 0 fantasy points, 1 fantasy point because they didn't need him. They were running the rock, killing clock, and dominating defenses. And to be honest, Jonnu Smith just wasn't a factor. And that's what I'm worried about. And I know that they've said that they want to use him more, but they got to prove it to me for me to kind of believe in the process. Moving on, our next quarterback on hand, TJ Hawkinson, another second-year tight end who I think could make another step this upcoming season. With Darrell Bevell as the offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions. Again, like I mentioned yesterday when we were talking about Matthew Stafford, Darrell Bevell was the former offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks when they were heavily targeting Jimmy Graham in the end zone. They want to make TJ Hawkinson the next Jimmy Graham. They want him to have 10-plus touchdowns in the red zone. And if Hawkinson can stay healthy, I think that he's capable of doing so. In college, he was more talented and produced more than Noah Fant. And Noah Fant, in my opinion, is more of an athletic version of a Hawkinson. But overall, Hawkinson is this Iowa tight end, similar to a George Kittle that can come in and dominate down the stretch. He proved it in week 1 of last season. But after that, kind of went downhill, then got injured. Hopefully, with the fact that this team wants to target the tight end, I mean, they targeted their tight ends 20+% of the time last season in terms of target share. we could potentially see TJ Hawkinson take that next step this year and kind of join this top 12 conversation. Moving on, Blake Jarwin. Blake Jarwin is going to inherit a lot of opportunity. I mean, Jason Witten had 83 total targets last year and was a top 12 tight end. He finishes the number 12 overall tight end. And now that I kind of look at what Witten produced last year, along with Blake Jarwin's opportunity, there's 126 plus targets for the tight end position available this upcoming season. And if that's all for Blake Jarwin and nobody else is taking any of those, I see Blake Jarwin potentially being one of these guys that can make a breakout season here. Though he's been in the league a couple of years and has had a couple good performances, he hasn't been a consistent play. And the signing of Jason Witten, him coming out of retirement last year, kind of put a little bit of a yellow light on his career, kind of slowed him down a bit. But ultimately, Blake Jarwin might be able to speed through this yellow red light and kind of get this opportunity and run away with it, because Dak Prescott, like we've seen throughout his career, always wants to target the tight end position, and I think Blake Jarwin could be a great opportunity for him this year. Moving on, the last tight end of this kind of grouping of the E tier, Jack Doyle. When we looked at the Indianapolis Colts offense, in the past 2 seasons, they've targeted the tight end position 166 and 135 times. You went ahead and you bring in Phillip Rivers, which is an upgrade at the quarterback position. And though he's not as good as Andrew Luck was, and though he is better than Jacoby Brissett is, at this moment in time, I'm not sure what we're going to see out of a Jack Doyle, Phillip Rivers combo. I think, sure, with Hunter Henry, he was able to, produce 10 plus fantasy points per game at the tight end position. But is Jack Doyle capable enough to be a weekly start? I don't think so. Not at this moment in time in this specific offense, but I think he will still evidently have overall fantasy value that can be played in a good matchup against a defense that, cannot cover the tight end position and be taken advantage of. I think he's a very, sleeper-esque tight end that at this moment in time, you can draft really late, and perhaps, he's not even drafted in some leagues. Take advantage of that. Moving on. We have the F tier overall tight ends. Again, like I mentioned before, Austin Hooper was a monster in Atlanta, but is he going to get that kind of opportunity this upcoming season? When we look at what Kevin Stefanski's done with the Vikings offense last year, he's going to bring that kind of scheme over to the Browns. They used the most 2 tight end sets last season at the Minnesota Vikings organization with Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph. With Austin Hooper and David Njoku, I want to hope that Austin Hooper can make these next steps into kind of being still a relevant tight end and be a top 12 guy. But to be honest, with the fact that Nick Chubb's going to get the ball, Kareem Hunt, Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham Jr., and you still have David Njoku there, I think Austin Hooper's opportunity is going to rely upon touchdowns. And if they're not able to be a successful enough offense to give him those touchdown opportunities down in the red zone, that he may not be relevant enough to be a top 12, 16 tight end this upcoming season. And that's why I'm a little worried about him. Moving on. Another tight end on hand, Kyle Rudolph. Like I mentioned, with Kevin Stefanski, they used a lot of 2 tight end set. And the fact of the matter is that Irv Smith kind of chipped into a lot of Kyle Rudolph's overall productivity last season. I mean, prior to last season, Kyle Rudolph was always a top 12 tight end. He was a guy that you could trust every year, that you could draft late in your draft, and he was going to be a top 12 tight end. But last year, he kind of fell out of it, was the number 14 overall tight end in fantasy. And I think this upcoming season, sure, the offensive coordinator will change, but they're still trying to feature Irv Smith as much as possible. And I think that's going to ultimately hurt Kyle Rudolph's value, which kind of leaves him down here in this tier. Moving on. Eric Ebron, who finds himself with a new team this offseason with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and still they have Vance McDonald. And I think when we go back and we look at what Vance McDonald was able to do when he was kind of sort of relevant, they still had Jesse James, who was stealing targets, stealing receptions. And I think if, in fact, you bring in Ebron, Vance McDonald's going to do the same thing that got done to him a couple of years back, in which they're going to target multiple tight ends. They're not going to feature one. And I hope Eric Ebron can be relevant, but touchdowns is going to be the name of the game. He's never been a guy that's going to catch the ball and only be a receiving kind of guy. He's a big body target who has pretty good football IQ in terms of where to get open in the red zone, in terms of how to read a defense and find a pocket in a zone. And I think overall, Eric Ebron can be a monster, but it's going to be red zone based. Moving on. Chris Herndon. Chris Herndon is very interesting because 2019, he didn't play. He was injured. But in 2018, he was a pretty good tight end. From weeks 6 through 17 of the 2018 season, he was the number 8 overall tight end in half PPR. And then when we look at last season and how much the Jets wanted to use the tight end position, they used it a lot. I mean, Ryan Griffin played 88.1% of the snaps when he played last season. And to be honest, even when he played, despite Ryan Griffin not being a great tight end in terms of a receiving option, he was still a relevant tight end. From weeks 6 through 12, prior to Ryan Griffin's injury that ended his season, he was the number 3 overall tight end in that stretch. That in itself, pretty ridiculous. And now that you go ahead and you bring back Chris Herndon, and we hear all these great things about him and Sam Darnold having this great chemistry in camp, and them once again finding each other and potentially creating a little bit more chemistry experience, I think there's a great chance that Chris Herndon this upcoming season can be one of these breakout tight ends in his 3rd year to kind of take over this offense, be the leading target outside of Jamison Crowder, and be an overall great productive tight end that you can get late in your upcoming drafts. Moving on, the last tight end of this tier, Greg Olsen. The Seahawks want to funnel target tight ends. I mean, they did it with whether it was with Will Disley or Jacob Hollister last year. No matter who was at tight end, as long as they were healthy and they were able to catch a ball, they were trying to feed them the ball. That's why they brought in Greg Olsen this year, because Greg Olsen doesn't stay healthy an entire season, but he's going to play, and if and when he does, he's going to be targeted a lot and get a good amount of fantasy points per game. I mean, we'll talk about Will Disley in a little bit, but I think Greg Olsen, if he can stay healthy, can easily be a top 15 tight end this season, similar to the way he was last year, having only played 14 games, was still the number 13 overall tight end in an offense with Kyle Allen at quarterback, in comparison to having Russell Wilson, who throws 30 plus touchdowns a year. I like Greg Olsen's chances this upcoming season. Moving on, Will Disley, like I was mentioning, Will Disley kind of proved to everybody just how valuable the tight end position was for the Seahawks last year. From weeks 1 through 5, prior to his injury, he was averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game in the half PPR scoring format. And to be honest, he had 4 touchdowns in 3 weeks. They love to use the tight end position. They love to use the tight end in the red zone, and that's where Will Disley found his value. And if and when Greg Olsen gets hurt or Will Disley gets hurt, they're going to obviously disappear. But if they can use a 2 tight end set and use it effectively, I think both these guys could have a pretty successful year this upcoming season. Moving on. Darren Fells. Darren Fells typically isn't talked about much because he only had 34 total receptions last year, but again, had 7 touchdowns. And I think, again, with the absence of a DeAndre Hopkins, there's going to be more opportunities for other receivers. Darren Fells in the red zone seems to be a guy that Sean Watson always wants to find down the stretch. And if, in fact, we once again see that again this year as a touchdown upside player, you can go ahead and potentially throw him into your lineups if you're dealing with injuries and or stuff down the line. But he's not someone that you potentially want to draft this upcoming season. More of a down the line, think about him. And if, in fact, he's playing well, you can go ahead and invest in him. Moving on. The next tight end on our list, O.J. Howard. Like I mentioned before, I think Rob Gronkowski is going to be a great tight end this upcoming season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But O.J. Howard was kind of given the short end of the stick last year. I mean, yes, he's been a great tight end in the past. I mean, when we go back and prior to him getting injured in 2018, he was a great overall tight end. But last year, nothing was really clicking. The offensive coordinator and head coach change kind of fared against him, in which they just kind of leaned away from him because he was making a lot of mistakes. He wasn't playing well. Jameis Winston wasn't putting him, O.J. Howard in great positions. And overall, the chemistry just faded away, and his usage was faded away. But this upcoming season, with an improved offense and a quarterback that loves to target the tight end position, if you have O.J. Howard on the field, if and when Rob Gronkowski's taking a break or they're trying to limit his snaps, O.J. Howard could be a valuable target down the stretch. And maybe, Gronk gets hurt. O.J. Howard immediately becomes a starting tight end of this team in a very, enticing offense. Moving on. Ian Thomas. Again, when we talked about Greg Olsen is no longer going to be a part of the Carolina Panthers offense, which is going to be the first time in quite some time. So who's going to be the starting tight end there? Probably Ian Thomas. And I think Teddy Bridgewater is a good enough quarterback to potentially create some value for a tight end like Ian Thomas. But ultimately, Ian Thomas is a younger guy, doesn't have much experience. Even though he's played at times when Greg Olsen went down, he stepped up. But ultimately, it's just going to matter on where this offense goes. They have a lot of targets to feed in the direction of DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, of course, and then Robbie Anderson. The fifth receiving options may be Ian Thomas, and that's why he slides down here in the H tier. Moving on, Jimmy Graham. If, in fact, we end up seeing Mitchell Trubisky at the quarterback position, then Jimmy Graham sits here and stays here at the H tier. But if Nick Foles wins the job, I truly do think that Jimmy Graham can be an F tier tight end because of how much Nick Foles prioritizes, short passing, giving the ball to the slot receiver and or to the tight end. I mean, what we've seen him do in the past with Zach Ertz, especially in the playoffs, in that magical playoff run that Philadelphia had, I think Jimmy Graham could be revitalized this year in Chicago and be given a lot of opportunity and take advantage of it with the quarterback change. Moving on, the last couple tight ends we want to talk about. Tyler Eifert going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think Tyler Eifert at this moment in time, though in the last couple of years, I mean, last year was the first time he played 16 games in a season in quite some time. I think now that we go ahead and we bring him into a new offense that needs a tight end, they just lost Leonard Fournette earlier this morning. Maybe Eifert down the stretch in the red zone. If they don't have someone that, can run it up the middle, you can find him as a potential tight end with, touchdown upside, of course. Moving on, the last tight end on our list today, Gerald Everett. I know Tyler Higbee's, the talk of the town in terms of the tight end position there, but Gerald Everett was not a bad tight end prior to getting injured. I mean, he was a top 10 PFF rated tight end prior to his injury. And though they did not use him in the back end of last season, I think if they want to use double tight end sets more often, they can definitely get away with it because of how talented these two tight ends are. And he could eventually have talent or, opportunity down the stretch. If Tyler Higbee goes down, we have a great tight end here in Gerald Everett that could step up and play and be a really productive overall tight end. Because prior to his injury, he was putting up 9 fantasy points per game on average, which again he could take advantage of. All right. Anyway, those are my tight ends that I wanted to talk about today. Thank you everybody for watching. If you liked today's video, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the like button. I really do appreciate your guys' continued support. Fantasy football content coming down the pike. These are long-winded videos. Typically, all my other videos are really short. You can go check out my tight end, strength of schedule videos. All those videos, at max 18 minutes, 16 minutes, 15 minutes at most. And these are really long-winded, so I'm glad we got these out of the way. Hopefully these guys, these help you guys out in your upcoming drafts. Regardless, for those of you guys who are looking for actual rankings or you want to talk to me, play in a fantasy league with me, join my community Discord. Go down to the description of the video, check out my Patreon. Thank you everybody very much for supporting the channel. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.